Thank you, Beth, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming out early on a Sunday morning. My goodness, I didn't think there'd be that many people here. My name is Madeline Yanov, and I'm very pleased to be here today to show you how you can find information about your ancestors that's missing on the 1890 census. We're going to look at substitutes, and it really is a crash course in just a little bit more than an hour. So make sure that you got your pen and paper ready. There's going to be a lot of information to take down. The title of today's talk is Finding Great-Grandpa or Locating Lost Ancestors in 1890 Census Substitutes. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to one of my great-grandpas. This is George Sperling. Now, this is a picture of him from the Widener Research Center in Buffalo Grove, Illinois. The Widener Research Center is a nonprofit organization that promotes the history of Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and the founding families. And the reason George is in their records is that he was smart enough to marry Ursula Widener, the daughter of one of the founding fathers. So we have a lot of information about George in there. Now, anyone who has used censuses before knows there's a gap between 1880 and 1900. The 1890 census, we've been told, was burnt. And so you're out of luck. If you had an ancestor that was born or married or died in that 20-year period, oh well, you're out of luck. I'm going to tell you that you can find that information for your ancestors. We're going to find out what questions were asked in the 1890 census, and that will then give us clues as to where to go to look for the answers. The important thing to remember is not one record is going to give you the same information that you find in the census. You're going to have to search multiple records, multiple sources to get multiple information. No 1890 census means no 1890 facts. So we're going to have to use alternative facts. Now, these are not fake facts. These are true facts, just so you know. And that's what I'm going to do today, is show you where to find these alternative sources and the answers to your ancestors. Okay, why are you not working? It was working earlier. I guess we'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, well. Can you press the arrow on the computer? I am going to have to do that, and it is not, it was working earlier. We'll have to, there we go. We'll have to do that manually. So what we're going to cover today is what really happened to the 1890 census, the type of data that was collected, why was this census different than others that came before and after, and why was it important? We'll review the questions that were asked. We'll talk about 3 main national census substitutes where you can find information on your ancestor. 4 local in scope census substitutes, what I like to call the lesser known census substitutes. Other sources for information for you to find out the information that would have been on the 1890 census. Where to locate those substitutes, and we'll end up with some tips on finding the substitutes. I want to gloss over the first 4 sections because I'd like to have the remainder of the talk be on the actual substitutes themselves. So what really happened to the 1890 census? Imagine that you are in a time machine and you have gone back to January 10th, 1921. You are in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. In the basement of the Commerce Building is a large file room. And the file room has multiple pine shelves that line all the walls. And on these shelves are large, overstuffed books that contain original census records. It is late afternoon and the building fireman is making his rounds. Suddenly, he notices smoke and fire coming out of the file room. A call is put out to the local fire department, and newspapers at the time estimated that 10,000 people came to watch the fire burn. The fire department arrives and they go into the building. They go to the floor above the basement and they start chopping holes in that floor, which is the ceiling of the basement. At that point, is this working? Mm-hmm. Yes. I have a love-hate relationship with microphones. At that point, they start pouring water through the holes, flooding the basement. The fire is extinguished at 9:45 in the evening. But the fire department continues to pour water until 10:30. At that point, they declare that the fire is out, and the head clerk opens up a window to let the smoke out. Everyone goes home, they're tired, they're sweaty, they're exhausted, they miss dinner, and everyone leaves with the exception of a couple of night watchmen. Now you have to remember, this is January, and they've left the windows open. The high that day was 42. The low was 34, which meant during the time they're fighting the fire, it's close to freezing. The slide on the left shows part of the room that was damaged in the fire. As you can see, it's a total mess. Here we have the holes that they cut into the ceiling. The slide on the left is a blow-up version of this section here. And as you can see, you have some books that are burnt and damaged. The next day the authorities come and they find ankle-deep water. The original estimates were that 25% of all the books burned. They were destroyed by the fire. 50% of the remainder were damaged by either fire, smoke, or water. The remains are then taken to a warehouse where they sit for 3 months, undisturbed. At that point, they are brought back to the Commerce Department, where they sit for another 13 years. They sit until Congress orders them to be destroyed by 1934. Now, one thing we have to remember is that archival preservation practices were not as thorough as they are today. Congress ordered the census destroyed because they figured between the smoke and the water damage and the mold that had grown on them, they were useless. It wasn't until 1935 that the National Archives opened and we actually had a place to put the nation's important documents. The fire did not burn all the censuses that were in that building. All the censuses from the beginning of our country's history were in that building. The ones from 1790 through 1870, with the exception of 1830 and 40, were on the 5th floor. Now, the fire was confined only to the basement, so those were safe. But there were other years that were also in the basement. Most of them had water damage. It was estimated that about 10% of all the other censuses had to be opened, dried out, and in some cases, recopied. Luckily for us, they survived, or else we wouldn't have had any censuses. The 1890 census was damaged the most because that was the one that was kept outside of the main vault. Now, they had what was considered a fireproof, waterproof vault at the time. But the problem was there was a small broken pane of glass that was in the vault, and that allowed water to seep through. So there were censuses that were on the lower shelves of the main vault that were damaged. Now just think for a minute. What would have happened if we had every census in that room and that had been destroyed? I mean, it's just unimaginable. A couple months ago, I had heard that the National Museum of Brazil had burned. And that particular museum held the majority of Brazil's historical documents and artifacts. I mean, that's such a terrible loss for that country. Can you imagine what would have happened if all of our censuses had been lost? Very sad. So what information can we learn from the census? Well, the census date was June 2nd, 1890, and it lasted for 1 month. The scope was 42 states. Hey, we almost have a full country here. Plus the territories of Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, Alaska, and Oklahoma. The population at that time was just a little bit under 63 million. And of that, only 6,160 names, or less than 1%, survived the fire. So you can see what a terrible loss that really is. This census was a bridge between the 1880 and the 1900 census insofar that it asked questions that were asked on both of those other censuses. But it did have some things unique just to it. It was divided into 8 sections. The first asked the individual's name and military service. The second, race, sex, and age. The third section, marital status and the number of children born to that mother. The fourth was nativity and also naturalization. Underemployment, they wanted to know what your occupation was and how many months in the last year you were unemployed. Under education, they wanted to know how many months in school an individual attended and if you could read and or write English. Section 7 dealt with health and social data. It asked questions regarding disabilities, if you had any chronic illnesses, if you were a prisoner, convict, pauper, or homeless child. And Section 8 dealt with farm and home, whether you own or rented, whether you owned your home free and clear or was it mortgaged, and if you were a farmer, did you farm your own land or were you a hired help? So was this different than others? Yes, in quite a few ways. First of all, this is a copy of one of the few names that had survived. This is William Smith in Perry County, Alabama. And as you can see, only his family is on the census page. That made it unique. And that was the first and only time we did this. Each family had its own page, or if you had, more than 5 children, then you had 2 pages. You cannot find any relatives on this page like you can with a regular census. This is similar to censuses that were taken in the UK. It was the first census to ask adult males whether they had fought in the Civil War. William was a Confederate soldier. Race questions were expanded. Before this, they were just white, black, or mulatto. Now they were expanded to include quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, and American Indian.
And what do those mean? What are quadroons?
A mulatto is half black, half white. Quadroon is a quarter. Octoroon is you're an eighth black. So they expanded the race questions. It also asked if you had any chronic illnesses. We'll go into that in just a little bit. But they wanted to know the name of that illness and how long you had it. It asked whether or not your family were paupers or prisoners or convicts, and there was no one like that in William's family. It also asked the farm information, and that's here. He owned his own farm, and he owned it free and clear. And lastly, the reason why this was different than other censuses was in the past, census enumerators would make several copies of their report. One was sent to Washington, and others were kept at state level. 1890, Congress directed the Commerce Department to make only the original copy. There were no extra copies made, and the original was supposed to be sent to Washington. And we know what happened with that.
What was the rationale for that?
To save money. Yeah. So why is this important? Well, there's three main reasons this particular census was important. It was the first census to be counted electronically. There was a commerce employee by the name of Herman Hollowith. He invented some punch cards to use to tabulate the results. Later on, he goes on to found IBM. This is the modern age, high technology here. Another reason that this was considered important was it basically showed that the American frontier was closed. You could go from one end of the country to the other and find civilization all the way through. So the frontier, as we think of it, was for the most part done. And the loss of this particular census led to the creation of the National Archives. There are three main national census substitutes. The first one are state censuses, and these should be in your handout. Now, many states took their own censuses between the federal censuses, but not all took them between 1880 and 1900. The ones that did are listed on the screen and in your handout. Territories at the time took censuses. Prior to becoming states, American territories took censuses because they needed to know how many people were in the territory, because there was a certain threshold of population that they needed to have before they could be admitted into the Union. And the last national census substitute is the 1890 Veterans Schedule. As I said, they asked every male whether or not he had served in the Civil War. If you had and you were a Union veteran, you were then put on an additional schedule, asked additional questions. Unfortunately, all of the states from Alabama through Kansas did not survive the fire. And you will find mainly Union veterans on the veteran census, but not always. This slide shows the 1885 Iowa State Census. Now, I'm going to be showing you different slides throughout this talk from the period between 1880 and 1900. They're not all going to be 1890 because you don't always have them for 1890, but you're looking to place your ancestor in that 20-year period. So this is 1885, and here we find Thomas Jenkins and his family. We find the name of the individuals in the family. We find out where they live. We have the age, the sex, and the race, and the marital status of each person. We have his occupation. Now, he was born in New York, but if he had been born in a county that was the county where he was living, he would have been checked off here. They also asked if your parents were native born or if they were foreign born. There was no room to tell us where those individuals would have been born. They were just interested in finding out, are you a native born person or did you come from another country? The information about where you were born will show up on other censuses. They wanted to know whether or not the person was eligible for military duty. And the answer for him was yes. They also wanted to know, was he a voter? And that was yes. If he had been an alien, not a natural citizen, that would have been checked here. And also, they wanted to know whether or not he could not read and write. And also if he had any disabilities. The information on state censuses is going to differ from state to state. But you can find some of the same information on these that you would have found on the 1890 census. Now here's a copy of the 1890 Territorial Census for Oklahoma. Now here we find William Smith and his family, their relationship to him, race, sex, and age. He's 33 years old. He was born in Alabama. Now here's a question that you normally don't get on a census. How many years have you been in the United States? Well, in his case, he was born in the United States, so it's a good thing that they match. But this is an interesting question. How many months have you been in the territory? He was there for 6 months before the census was taken. Well, that's very good if you are trying to track the migration pattern of your ancestors, because now you know that he was not in Oklahoma before, probably November, December of 1879. One of the names for Oklahoma was the Oklahoma Territory, but another name of it was the Indian Territory. So you had a lot of soldiers in Oklahoma. You had a lot of forts and a lot of cavalry. One of the questions they asked was, if you're a soldier, what is your state? Where are you from? And what's your regiment? That might be helpful if you're trying to trace somebody down. And of course, at the end, they wanted to know, could you read and write? As I said, the regular census had asked about military service, and the purpose was to find all the Union veterans. Here we have the veteran census for Henderson Griffith. It gives his information, he was a private. It also gives the information regarding the company and the regiment he was in, when he enlisted, when he was discharged, how long he stayed in the Union Army. He was in for 1 year, 2 months, and 11 days. It also gives the nearest post office box. Now, why is this important? This is Lawrence County, Ohio. I've never been there. Some of you may have never been there, but how do we know? Maybe it's a big county. If we can narrow down the area of the county that he lived in, that'll help you pinpoint your ancestor. And the other question that they asked was, do you have a disability as a result of the war? In his case, he did. He had what's known as disease of eye and also piles, which is another term for hemorrhoids. As I mentioned earlier, the census enumerators would take down everyone's military service. Now, here we find, it's a little hard to see, but I will explain why it's hard to see in a minute. Whoops. All right, here we go. Here we find James Goodwin. He was a private in an Alabama regiment. And he is living in Texas, in Mitchell County, Texas. And his closest post office box is Colorado, Texas. Luckily for him, he did not have any disabilities like Henderson had. Now, the enumerators were only supposed to put down Union veterans. This enumerator puts down all these veterans and then realizes his mistake. So then he crosses out the ones that were Confederate. But we can still see them. So my advice to you is, don't ignore the veteran censuses just because your ancestor wore gray instead of blue. Because like James, you may actually find them in here. Local census substitutes are mainly four. When I talk about local, I'm talking about local in nature. A state, a region, or a city, as opposed to national. We have city directories, tax records, voter lists, and school censuses. Now, if you've ever used city directories, you know they are invaluable for finding people, putting people in a certain place at a certain time. The main reason they were created was marketing. The local businesses wanted to know who lived in the area that they marketed to so they could drum up more business. And usually you would have the head of the household listed. A lot of times the wife was not listed. In the later censuses, city directories, they were, but in the 1880s and 1890s, they generally weren't unless they were a widow. And since these were usually produced on a yearly basis, it's a good way to find your ancestor around 1890. The slide on the left shows William Phelan, who resided on the northwest corner of East Lincoln Avenue and Croxton area. And they have him associated with the Arctic Ice Company. William is my great-grandpa. What he would do is he would go around and deliver ice for people. And people would put his big, huge ice blocks in a little thing that you may have seen, or maybe your mother had or grandmother had, called ice boxes, the precursor to our refrigerators. So he would do that all year long, deliver the ice to people, and in the wintertime he would deliver coal for heating. Now, on the left slide is the business section of that city directory. They were usually divided like the yellow pages and the white pages. And we see that he is listed as an ice dealer. And he's working out of 108 South Main Street. But that is the location of the Arctic Ice Company. But there are other people that have that same location too. Fred Lebowski and, there's another one here.
McGregor.
Yeah, McGregor and William. What William was, he was an independent contractor. Arctic Ice Company was a wholesaler, and so that's where he was associated, but he was not an employee. That is why he is listed separately. I have found great-grandpa using a census substitute. Now here's a city directory for Nashville, Tennessee. You can use city directories to also provide family relationships, which you would have found in the census. Here we see Richard Fagan. Richard is a maternal great-grandpa. William was a paternal great-grandpa. We see him, who's a city laborer, living at 1115 Cedar Street in Nashville. But also living at that same address is we see a Christopher Fagan, who's a harness maker, a John Fagan, who's a molder, and a Patrick Fagan, who's also a molder. Those three men are Richard's sons. He's listed as having the house, and they are listed as bedding or boarding there. So you can use city directories to create a family relationship. Now, the city directory was really important when I was looking for information on Richard, because in 1880, he was still in Ireland. 1900, he was on a census, but he died 3 weeks after the 1900 census was taken. So this particular document, plus the 1900 census, plus his death record, are the only 3 records I have to show that he was ever in Nashville, let alone the United States. We have not been able to find any immigration papers, and he was never naturalized. So not only can I find where he was in that period, but this is all I have to prove that he even existed there. But I have found my second great-grandpa. I am on a roll now. Tax records are another great source for finding missing people. While the censuses were taken every 10 years, tax records are considered annual censuses because they will place a certain person in a certain location at a certain time. Now, the questions are going to vary from state to state. I'm going to show you 2 examples and you see what the difference is. This is Bandera County in Texas. Bandera County had a lot of horse properties in it and a lot of ranches. So a lot of the questions they're going to ask will be related to that. This happens to be a combination of real property and personal property. We find C. Anderson and the 4 pieces of property he owns. Here we find the original grantee. We also find out whether or not his property was located within his town limits or out of the town limits. It was out of the town limits. So we have the information on the real property, but over here we have information on his personal property. He had 1 wagon valued at $20, and there was a tax on those in addition to any other farm tools. He also had 4 horses and mules valued at $100 and 150 head of cattle valued at $750. Now, this doesn't tell us much more. It just tells us where he was in 1890 and his approximate, net worth. But it does give us clues as to where to look for other records. This is another tax record, same year, but this is Taylor County, Kentucky. Here we find Abel Bennett. He has 70 acres of land, but this one tells us who his nearest neighbor is. So that might be helpful. And the nearest neighbor has the same last name as him, so that might be worth looking into because it may be a relative. His land was valued at $500. He had one male over the age of 21 in the household. He had 2 children between 6 and 20. Now this doesn't give us the names, but at least this can start us on recreating the family. And under the comments section, the tax collector would enter certain comments. If you were non-white, that would be entered. If you had a musical instrument, there was a special tax on that. The thinking was, if you have enough disposable income to buy a piano or fancy guitar or whatever, well then you certainly have enough money to give the government. So they made a point to make sure that that was listed, so you were taxed on that. But again, it's not going to tell us everything that was on the census, but it does give us some clues. Voter records can be very helpful in placing your ancestor. Here we have the 1891 voter records for Davidson County, Tennessee. Davidson County is the county that Nashville is in. And here we have Adam Weber, age 45, and underneath him, Frank Weber, age 21. Now, Frank is Adam's son. Frank is also my grandfather. This is great-grandpa. And I had to put his picture in because I only have 2 pictures of great-grandfathers, George and Adam, so I had to, give equal time to my mom's side of the family. But this doesn't give us much more information other than the fact that we know that these people lived in Davidson County in 1891 and they were old enough to vote. And that's all the voter list was concerned with. Do you live in the county and can you vote? But I have now found my 3rd great-grandpa. In fact, I've only found 2 records that he's listed in. This one and City Directory. He was a very well-known tailor in Nashville. Now, other voter lists are going to give you more information. This is an 1890 Chicago voter list. And in it, we find a gentleman by the name of C.S. Darrow. That's the initials for the famous lawyer Clarence Darrow. He lived at 905 Sawyer Avenue. He was born in Ohio. He was white. And, oh, this is interesting. They're asking, how long have you lived in the precinct? 6 months. How long have you lived in the county? 1 year. How long have you lived in the state? 1 year. Another way you can track your ancestors' migration. Because we know that longer than a year, Clarence is not in Illinois. He's only been in Illinois for a year. Now, if he had been naturalized, that would have shown up here. It also would have shown up what court he had been naturalized in. One of the things that they asked in this particular voter record was, when was the last time you registered to vote? You had to register multiple times. Not like California, you just register once and then you find out he voted in the last election. And look, he had ballot number 68 also. So I guess Chicago had problems even back then with their voting.
In California, during that time, California, you did register every...
So that it must have been the time period, not like now, yeah. You can,
And no women are in some states, or Wyoming or whatever, are women on any of the voter registration?
not, it, yeah, well, not normally, and certainly not in Illinois, and certainly not in California.
Nowhere that women got
Yeah.
to vote in 1934. or-
But some states let women vote a little earlier. Yeah.
In the West.
Yeah. You can also find information about your ancestors around 1890 if you look at school records. Now, this is a school census from Lawrence County, South Dakota. And in it, we find Gary Woodson, age 15, his sister Bessie, who is age 13, and their parent, James. Now, this is not going to tell us anything else, but at least it shows there's a family relationship and where they were located. Now, school records don't only provide you information about way past censuses, you can also use them to find information about modern censuses. In 2000,
Can I just ask, where do you find?
Yeah.
Where did you find, I mean, are they on the internet, or where do you find them?
some of them are. We will talk about that when I tell you where do you go to find those things. But yeah, some of them are. Some of them are in books that have been produced by various different counties. In 2000, I lived in Gretna, Nebraska, which was a small town halfway between Lincoln and Omaha. It was just off of I-80, about 30 miles from Lincoln, about 30 miles from Omaha. And I took a part-time job as a census enumerator. We were supposed to go to the houses that had not mailed back their census questions. So this one particular time, I go to this house and a gentleman answers the door, and I introduce myself, show him my credentials, my badge and everything, and tell him why I was there, and started asking questions. Well, he would not answer any questions. So I had to reassure him that his answers would be kept confidential and that I was mandated by the Constitution to take this count, but he still didn't want to give me any information. So finally he did. What he told me was, there are 4 people in this house, a male and a female above 18 and a male and a female below the age of 18. Thanks a lot. I mean, I might as well have been taking the 1840 census for that amount of information. So, being a determined researcher, I came up with a novel idea to find out the names of the people that were in the household. Now, we knew his name because the government had his name down as, you know, the head of the household and the owner of that property, but I couldn't find the other people's names. So I went to the public library and I started looking through school yearbooks. Now, Gretna at the time had only 3 schools, 1 elementary, 1 middle, and 1 high school. And the surname was unique enough that there were only 2 students in the whole system that had that name. And you guess it, a boy and a girl. So I got the names of those students. Extrapolating the age of the grades that they were in, I was able to come up with an approximate age for those children. My big bonus was I found the mother's name because the school yearbook had listed all the members of the then PTA, and Mama was on the PTA. So I got her name too. I didn't get her age, but I got her name at least. Now, I did not violate anyone's privacy. I got these records, these were public records, held at a public repository, the library. And I was able to finish completing my census duties. So don't discount yearbooks or school records if they exist when looking for both modern day relatives and also looking for ancestors. The lesser known census substitutes are basically four. What they call a special census in 1885, the 1890 New York City Police Census. The Oakland Tribune actually had a list of people, and we'll go into that in a little bit, and the 1890 Delaware African American Census. For some reason, Congress decided that an additional census should be taken in 1885 between the two regular ones. And it ordered all the states to participate. In order to sweeten the pot a little bit, Congress said, we will reimburse you 50% of the cost of hiring census enumerators. But even though all the states were mandated to do that, not all of them followed Congress's dictates. Only Nebraska, Florida, and Colorado, along with New Mexico and the territories, did this. This is a special census for Nebraska. Now, the lawmakers in Nebraska were pretty clever. They normally did a state census anyway. So they used this to double as their state census, and they figured, why not let Washington pay for something we were going to do anyway? So that was pretty clever of them. This is the family of James Woodard. He is 40 years old and a farmer, and it shows that his parents were born in England and Ireland. And it gives us the ages and the sex of everyone else in the household. This is very similar to the 1880 census, as you will see with some of the state censuses. But just know that when they took these censuses, this special census, not only did they do the population schedule, they also created agriculture, manufacturing, and mortality schedules for these too, just like they had up through 1880. This is the 1890 police census. Now, in 1890, as in modern times, communities often thought they were undercounted. And the New York City Council did not trust the federal government's count. So they decided to take their own. And actually that turned out to be advantageous to them because they found 13% more names. Now, New York County at that time consisted of Manhattan and the West Bronx. The majority of the people there were living in tenements. So what the city council did is they directed the police department to go door to door, knocking on the door to find out who lived in each address, what their sex was and what their age was. Now, these things are indexed, but they are not indexed according to name, they are indexed according to location. You can find those indexes at Ancestry.com. You can find images of them at the Family History Library, and I'll give you the 3 microfilm numbers that they're located on. The first microfilm number is 1304781. The second is 1309970. And the last is microfilm number 130 4777. Now, if you want to find a person, it's a very complicated procedure. If you're interested in using this, come see me at the very end and I'll give you directions on how to do it. It's a little hard to explain on the screen. But just know that if your ancestor lived in New York around 1890, they may be listed on this particular census substitute. Now, the people in Oakland, California also thought that they were being undercounted. In fact, some of them thought they weren't even being counted at all. So, the Oakland Tribune, between June 18th and June 26th of 1890, published letters to the newspaper of people who said, "We haven't been counted. No one's come to our block." These are the names and the number of people that are here. One of them, an officer, O.D. Brown, reported that no enumerator had been along in the territory bounded by Adeline, Market, 18th, and 21st Streets. He says the territory has been neglected by some oversight. He's being generous. He lives in the district and canvassed for names, and he got tired of writing. And these are the names he took. Now, this is just an extract of that page. But here you can find at least the person's name, the address they lived in Oakland, and how many were in the family. Now, I know some of these have the words spelled out, some of them have the number. That's not me. I copied this the way it was in the newspaper. But the important thing is, at least this can give you an idea how many people were in Officer Brown's family by 1890, so that you can start to reconstruct a family. It won't tell you everything, but at least it tells you who was where, when. One of the smallest and least known census substitutes is the Delaware African American census. This list was composed of African Americans who lived in Delaware both in 1890 and also 1900. And this is from the 1890 section, and here we find Levi Lewis, who's a day laborer. He lived in Enumeration District 56 of Milford in Kent County in Delaware. We're lucky we have that because everybody else just has their name listed. But at least you know Levi was there. Now, I told you that it was the smallest. There's only 444 names on this census. But if Levi was your ancestor, this would still be priceless. Okay, now I'm going to, hopefully briefly, discuss where to find the type of information on the 1890 census. A few slides back, we saw that it was divided into different sections, questions that were asked. Here are options to find information that would have been found in those questions. There are always alternative sources to find the information you need. Now, most of them are fairly obvious, but sometimes we get so focused in on one thing, we forget because we can't see the forest or the trees. So if you want to find any record that has to do with a name and a relationship to the head of household, you're going to check birth records, marriage records, wills and probate, pension records from the military, and also county histories. Personal descriptions, you're going to find those in some military records, naturalization records, prison records, and also school records. Here's an example of the UC Berkeley yearbook for 1890. In it, we have all of the seniors listed. But what's interesting is they will have the age of the senior, both in year and month, and a description. So you can tell how tall somebody was and how much they weighed. Now, the yearbook, just like most yearbooks, especially high school yearbooks, you're going to find out, well, what's your future? You know, what do you want to do? What do you want to be remembered by? What is your occupation in the school? You know, this was a good boy. This was a ladies' man. He considered himself a ladies' man. You know, what was going to be your future occupation? Paterfamilias, teacher, engineer, lady, novelist, and of course, the ever popular, what is your favorite beverage to drink? Most of these were beer, like a typical school yearbook, but at least you can get information on a person's physical description. You're going to find information about a person's marital status, obviously, from marriage records, birth records, death records, and pension records. Now, this image is one of only 2 documents I have on Jane Fagan. And I apologize for the condition of this. This was really bad when I came across this. Jane is the daughter of Richard Fagan, the day laborer that was in Nashville. Jane was also the older sister of my grandmother. The family story goes, Jane came over from Ireland, and she went to a Catholic convent school in Nashville. There she met a man by the name of George March, and they fell in love, which would be, you know, good news, except in 1890, actually a couple years before that, they were different religions. Jane was Irish Roman Catholic, and George was Irish Protestant. So when the news got back to Ireland that Jane was going to marry George, Mama threw up her hands and started crying. Papa was a little bit more sensible. He sold the family farm to his brothers and moved the entire family to Nashville to try to talk some sense into Jane. It didn't work because in October of 1890, Jane married George. Now, this is only one of 2 documents I have on Jane, because she was not in the United States in 1880. She never appeared in the 1900 census because she died in childbirth just a couple years after she got married. So the marriage license and her death record are the only 2 records I have that Jane was ever in Nashville or even ever in the United States, because like her father, we can't find any passenger list. You're going to find information on a person's nativity, obviously through birth records, church records, naturalization records, newspaper accounts, especially obituaries. They love to put so-and-so, you know, born in Bavaria, you know, came to the United States in such and such a year. But you're going to find out where the people were born in newspapers and also county histories. Occupation, you're going to find them in city directories, some voter registration lists, wills. If a man leaves all of his carpenter tools to his son, it's a good bet that maybe he was a carpenter. Newspapers, of course, you know, if someone was a farmer and he came into town, they're going to talk about, you know, so-and-so came into town to sell his grain. Also, prison records will give you an occupation. Education, you're going to find the information on school records and also yearbooks. The health information. One of the things that this particular census talked about was, chronic illnesses and so on. You might be able to find information on your ancestor at sanitariums or asylums, orphanages, and also prison records. If you cannot find a child with their parents, you need to look in orphanages. Now, we tend to think that orphanages are places where they put children whose parents had died. Many times in that period, the parents were still alive, but they could not take care of their children. There was no foster care system at the time, so if the parents could not take care of the children, if there were no relatives to take care of the children, they were put in an orphanage. And here we have the Goldberg family. We have Herman, Tessie, Fanny, Telly, Moses, and Betsy. They're the children of Abraham and Anna Goldberg, who came from Russia to New York. They were admitted into the orphanage in 1893, August of 1893, and they stayed in the orphanage until 1896, where they were discharged back to their parents. So, as I said before, if you cannot find children with relatives or their parents, you might want to look in orphanages because their children were there with living parents. You might also want to try looking for people in asylums. Here's an example of a lady, Mrs. Rayon, who was in San Diego and she was admitted to the Stockton State Hospital in 1890. The beautiful thing about this admission record is all the information it gives that you would have found on the census. You find her age, where she was born. She last lived in Illinois before she came to California, and she had been in California for 32 of her 35 years. So that helps you with migration. She has 3 children, the youngest of 7. Oh, it gives her maiden name. How about that? And her occupation, dressmaker. I'm not necessarily going to read everything about this particular admission, but the thing is you need to know she was admitted with a diagnosis of acute mania, and they thought the cause was la grippe, which was a very virulent form of the flu. She was admitted March 31st, 1890, and discharged a little less than a year later, 11 months later. And she was sent to Paris and San Diego. Now, the interesting thing is, along the side is the address of someone that she knows that lives in Paris, San Diego, her daughter, and it gives the daughter's name. So you would be able to find 2 people that lived in 1890 through these records. If you cannot find a man who was living between 1880 and 1900, and you've searched all the usual sources, you might want to try prisons. Here we have Thomas Collins, an inmate in San Quentin. He's from Missouri. A Napa court on September 25th, 1890, sentenced him to 10 years of prison for assault with a deadly weapon with intent to commit murder. So we find out that, okay, so he, in 1890, he's in the Napa area. We also find out his age, he's 32, his occupation, speculator, and it gives his physical description. He's 5'9" and 1/8 inches tall, fair complexion, blue eyes, red hair, And we even got his mugshot, courtesy of the California State Archives. And he died in prison in 1897. Without this record, we would not have any idea what Thomas was doing around 1890, or where he was.
It almost makes you wish that your relative was in prison to get all that amazing information and dispersion.
I know, it almost pays to be bad sometimes because you've got more records than someone that doesn't do anything.
And where do you access prison records?
Pardon me?
Where can you access prison records?
That was from Ancestry, but the actual records for California prisons, like San Quentin, are in the state archives here in Sacramento. The last section of questions that you're going to find information for is home and farm data. So if you're looking for your ancestor and they're not on the 1890 census, you're going to find information about his home and farm, obviously from land records, probate records, tax records, newspapers. Newspapers at the time loved to talk about who was delinquent in paying their taxes, or who got in trouble, or whose property was being foreclosed on, and then also county records. So now you know what to look for. Where can you find it? Always start with the municipal and county archives and courthouses. Most records are kept at the local level, and those of you that have been doing genealogy for a while know that. Your land, your tax, your probate, and your vital records will mainly be at the local level, which is the county for most people. If they are not kept at the county level, then you're going to try the state archives and state libraries, because they may have been sent here. And the information about Thomas is a perfect example, because that was kept at the state archives here in Sacramento. You also will find information on prisons, schools, orphanages, and asylums at state archives. Your local, county, and state genealogy or historical societies may have copies of records that were produced in that area. And that could include asylums, orphanages, and school records. Online, and this should be in your handout, you're going to find records, census substitutes on Ancestry, Family Search, and the Family Search Wiki, MyHeritage, Fold 3, mainly for the military records, Google and Google Books, Internet Archive, US Gen Web, which would be the state and then the county that you're interested in, Cindy's List, Linkpedium, and Don's List. And Don's List is especially good for city directories. The best book out there is a book by the name of Census Substitutes and State Census Records by William Dollarhide. He has 3 volumes to that, and basically each volume corresponds with a section of the country. So volume 1 has to do with the East Coast, volume 2 has to do with all the states in the middle of the country, and volume 3 is the West Coast.
We do have that here in the library. We do have that.
Oh, wonderful. So go upstairs when you finish with this so you can look at that. Also, newspapers. Excuse me, church and school histories. I have, it's a mimeographed form, a booklet that was produced by the city of Buffalo Grove to celebrate the 100th anniversary of St. Mary's Church, which was very integral to the history of Buffalo Grove. And in it you find George Sperling. Like I said, he lucked out because he married the right woman. But you're going to find information on your ancestors both in church and school and county histories, and also newspapers. Now, in the newspapers, you're going to find the obvious birth, death, marriages, but you're also going to find notices that so-and-so is moving away. And, you know, sometimes they even listed where they were moving to. Who was delinquent in paying their taxes? Court cases and land transfers. And you can usually find those on Chronicling America, which is the Library of Congress's newspaper collection. You can also find them on newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, Newspapers Archives, and state digital collections. California has a state digital collection. It's run by UC Riverside. And that plus the Illinois digital collection are two of the best in the country. But if you want to know where the digital collection is for another state, all you have to do is just Google it. Google the name of the state and then digital collection. Most states will have that. So now we know what to look for, and now we know where to look. I have some tips for you for researching census substitutes. First of all, have a plan. Focus on what you really want to find out. Don't waste your time picking all the low-hanging fruit or going after the bright, shiny objects. Because what will happen is you will get a lot of information, but it may not be what you need. And you will have wasted your time and your energy. So have a plan. Know what to focus on, and then look for that, and then you go to the next thing. You have to be patient, because you are going to be looking at more records than just the census. We're spoiled with the census. You've got one document that has all this information for all these people. Now you have to recreate this information for every person using a lot of other resources. So you have to be patient. Be creative. Consider the type of sources that might have the information you need. We went through a whole bunch of slides where it showed where you can find information about a person's occupation, where you can find information about marital status and so on. So you've got to be creative and think of what sources will have the information that I would have needed for the 1890 census. Leave no stone unturned. The repository for records of your ancestors may be located somewhere other than where they lived. City directories for New Orleans for 1892 are not in New Orleans. They are in the Newberry Library in Chicago. The actual Searcy County, Arkansas personal property tax for 1890 is not in Arkansas. It's in the Sutro Library in San Francisco. So some of these records may not be where your ancestor lived. So you have to be open to the possibility that they are other places. So leave no stone unturned.
So how would you know that it was located in the Sutro Library from another state?
Well, I can only tell you what I do, and I may not be typical, so take that with a grain of salt. Every now and then, I just look at online library catalogs to see if they have books or records. And then once I find out that they might have it, most libraries have their catalogs online. They may not have copies of the book digitized, but at least they'll have that listing of, 1890 Searcy County personal property tax book. Well, knowing that, then either you can go or you can get someone to go to those places to look it up. Like I said, I'm sure there's other ways of doing that. That's just the way I do that. If you don't live near a location where your where your ancestor lived, and a particular book may have your ancestor listed in it, then I would suggest maybe you reach out to the local genealogy society in that area and ask if they can do a lookup. I know in Contra Costa County, we have people write us all over the country wanting us to do lookups for their ancestor who died in Contra Costa County. And I'm almost positive that that happens in Sacramento too. So, I mean, that's one way you can do it. Yes?
I just wanted to make a suggestion for the school records. If you know of a college that your ancestor went to and that college still exists, I would write to them, because I have gotten really good information from colleges, from 1898 and 1916, and, earlier than that, later than that.
Also, a lot of college yearbooks are also digitized and online now. So you might want to try that too. Yes?
Sorry, I had a question, and I apologize if you covered it. But what about the other states, like Mississippi, Maryland, Virginia, like those type of states? I only saw a few on there. Do you have records for those states?
I would say contact first of all, contact the county that your ancestor was in, see what records they have, and then go and contact the state archives and the state libraries, because the state archives are the repository for the records.
And I think my situation may be a little different. I know like the slave owner, I got back to the 1400s. But, it's the other portion which I'm trying to find. Like, I've looked through some property records. I just kind of find, like, a first name basis. But, like, is there any other way to, like, track, when you consider property, like, to track that, where they write out each person? Like, is there any records like that?
What time period are you talking about?
During this time period, the 1890s.
Okay, so after the Civil War.
Or even
It depends. It depends if they own the land or if, let's say, they were sharecroppers on the land. I would still say check the state library and the state archives. Because those kind of records, if they're not found on the local level, land records, then they will most certainly be in the state archives. Now, just because the 1890 census had one family per page doesn't mean the substitutes have that. You're going to look for collateral lines. You're going to look just like you do for other ancestors. Make sure you look for the siblings, the aunts, uncles, cousins, and in-laws, because they're going to be found along with the family on those records. The outlier was just the actual census itself.
For people that were in San Francisco during the Great Quake, have any records survived any place?
I think that's going to be another topic. There are some. In fact, I think, Beth, you can tell her, there's a name of a book that's very good that discusses what records are still available.
The ashes.
Yes, that's the one.
And we have that in our genealogy collection. There's an older edition, the first edition, and then there's a new edition. We have that on the second floor of the genealogy.
Another reason to go to your public library. They have all these cool things.
I think it's called Breaking the Ashes.
Do not make assumptions about your ancestor. The family could have moved out of the state and back again in 20 years. So just because they left, don't assume that they left for good, and also don't assume that they always remained there, because they had been. Don't forget to look in county and church histories for information about your ancestors. And last of all, researching census substitutes is going to take up a lot more time than your regular research. So I ask you to remember Tip number 2, which is be patient. So, if you have looked in every single source you can think of, and you still can't find your ancestor, it may not be you that has the problem. I am going to leave you with an observation from a census enumerator from 1865, but it still held true in 1890. Qualifications of a census taker. Occupation, census taker. I am a census taker for the city of Buffalo. Our city has grown very fast in recent years, and now, in 1865, it has become a hard and time-consuming job to count all the people. There are not many that can do this work, as it is necessary to have an education, which a lot of persons do not have. Another attribute needed for this job is good spelling. For many of the people to be counted can hardly speak English, let alone spell their names. Yes?
So I just had my own little story on this one. I came here to try and find more about my great-grandmother. No, my great-great-grandmother. Her mother, or my great-grandmother's mother, is listed in a census. However, if you look carefully, you realize that the age